The boy appeared out of nowhere. That was the only way Arthur Penfield could describe it afterward, when people asked him how it all began. One moment he was sitting alone at his usual corner table at Hearthstone, the quiet restaurant on Wellington Street where he'd eaten dinner by himself every Thursday for the past 11 years. The next moment there was a child standing 3 feet away from him, staring at his plate with an expression that wasn't quite hunger and wasn't quite longing. It was something older than both of those things, something that had no clean name. The boy was maybe 10, maybe 11. It was hard to tell. He was small for whatever age he was, wearing a gray hoodie that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone thin at the elbows, and sneakers with a crack along the left sole that let in the cold. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His face was clean, which surprised Arthur more than anything else. Whatever else this child had or didn't have, someone had taught him to wash his face. Arthur Penfield had built 3 hospitals in his lifetime. Not metaphorically. Actual hospitals, the kind with cardiac units and neonatal wards and names carved in granite above the entrance. He sat on the boards of 2 universities and had been profiled in the Globe and Mail 4 separate times. He owned a house in Rosedale with 11 rooms, most of which he never entered. He was 61 years old, and he had learned, over the course of those 61 years, to be a man who was not easily caught off guard. The boy caught him off guard. "Excuse me," the child said. His voice was careful, like he'd practiced the words before coming in. "Could I sit with you? Just while I warm up. I won't bother you." Arthur looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked around the restaurant, at the other tables, the couples and the business dinners, and the woman by the window eating alone with a paperback propped against her water glass. No one was watching. No one was paying any attention at all to a small boy standing in the entrance to an upscale restaurant, asking a stranger if he could share his table. "Sit down," Arthur said. The boy sat. He folded his hands on the table in front of him, another thing that surprised Arthur, that deliberate, almost formal gesture, and he looked at the white tablecloth and he didn't say anything. Arthur watched him for a moment. "Are you hungry?" The boy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm okay. That's not what I asked." A pause, then quietly, "A little." Arthur signaled the server without making a production of it. He ordered the boy a bowl of chowder and some bread and a glass of milk, the way you'd order for a child you knew, not making it into a moment, not performing generosity. The server, a young woman named Kira, who had worked Thursdays at Hearthstone for 3 years and knew Arthur's habits almost as well as he did, didn't bat an eye. The boy ate carefully. Not quickly, the way Arthur might have expected. Not desperately, the way hunger sometimes looked. He ate like someone who had been told more than once not to rush, who had internalized the lesson even when the circumstances no longer called for it. There was a dignity in it that Arthur found he couldn't look away from. "What's your name?" Arthur asked. "Cody." "How old are you, Cody?" 11. "Where do you live?" The boy looked up from his bowl for the first time. His eyes were gray-green, the color of the lake in November, and there was something in them, not fear exactly, but the expectation of difficulty, which is its own particular kind of exhaustion in a child that young. "Around," he said. Arthur had been a hospital administrator for 30 years before he retired into philanthropy. He knew what around meant, coming from an 11-year-old on a February night in Toronto, when the temperature outside was -14. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" he asked. Cody looked back at his bread. He broke off a piece, methodical, precise. "I'm figuring it out." Arthur Penfield sat back in his chair and looked at this small, careful boy eating chowder at his table, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not pity, which he would have recognized and managed, but something with more weight to it. Something that felt almost like recognition, though he couldn't have said what it was he was recognizing, or why. He stayed at the table long after his own dinner was finished. He let Cody eat. He asked a few more questions, quiet ones, and Cody answered most of them in that same measured, cautious way, giving just enough without giving everything. He'd been staying at a shelter on Jarvis Street, but the shelter had a 3-night limit, and his 3 nights were up. His mother had been in the hospital since December. He had an uncle somewhere in Hamilton, but he didn't have a phone number for him. School was complicated right now. When the bill came, Arthur paid it. Then he asked Cody, as simply as he could manage, whether he would be willing to speak with someone. A woman Arthur knew at an organization that helped children in exactly this kind of situation, someone who would not put him in a system before trying every other option first. Cody considered this for a long moment, with the seriousness of a person who has learned that adults rarely do what they say they'll do. "Would you come," he asked, "to wherever you're sending me? Would you actually come with me?" Arthur said yes. He meant it. The organization was called Lakeshore Compass, and the woman who ran it was named Bernadette Ewan. Mid-40s, practical, the kind of person who had stopped being surprised by anything years ago without becoming cynical about any of it. She met them at the door of the office on Adelaide Street at 9:30 that night, which told Arthur something about her that he already half knew from her reputation. While Bernadette sat with Cody and went through the practical questions, Arthur stood in the hallway and called the hospital. He had privileges at Toronto General from his years on the board. Not clinical privileges, but the kind that meant phone calls got returned. He asked after a woman named Sherry Brandt, admitted in December, and was told enough to understand that what Cody had said was true and that the situation was serious. He stood in that hallway for a long time after he hung up. He thought about the way Cody had folded his hands on the tablecloth. He thought about the cracked sole of the left sneaker, he thought, for reasons he couldn't entirely account for, about a December morning 22 years ago, about a decision he had made when he was 39 and frightened and not yet the kind of man he would later become. He pushed the thought away. He was good at that. Bernadette found him temporary accommodation, a family in East York who'd worked with Lakeshore Compass before, a couple named the Abernathys who had a spare room and a retriever named Biscuit, and a completely no-nonsense approach to children, in difficult circumstances that Bernadette clearly trusted. Arthur drove Cody there himself. It was after 11 by the time they arrived, and the porch light was on, and Helen Abernathy opened the door before they'd even knocked. Cody stood on the front step and looked up at Arthur. "You'll come back," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Thursday," Arthur said. "Same time." He drove home to Rosedale, through streets that were quiet and cold and orange-lit, and he sat in his car in the driveway for 10 minutes before he went inside, which was something he had never done before in 11 years of living in that house. He went back Thursday, and the Thursday after that. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing. Bernadette, to her credit, didn't ask him to explain himself. She simply facilitated, arranged supervised visits to Sherry at the hospital, kept Arthur informed in the careful, measured way of someone who had seen people like him before. Well-meaning, well-resourced, and very possibly about to lose interest. She was waiting to see which kind he was. He wasn't sure himself. Cody was at the hospital when Arthur arrived on the third Thursday. Sherry Brandt was having a better day. She was sitting up in the bed, thin in the way that serious illness makes people thin, with Cody's same gray-green eyes and Cody's same way of watching a room from a careful distance. She thanked Arthur in a voice that was still stronger than her body suggested it should be. "You didn't have to keep coming," she said. "I know," Arthur said. She looked at him for a moment, in a way he couldn't quite read. "He talks about you. He says you're not what he expected." What did he expect? Someone who'd hand him off and feel good about it. She paused. "He's been disappointed before." Arthur stayed for an hour. He and Sherry talked carefully around the things that mattered while Cody sat between them and ate a bag of chips from the vending machine, pretending not to listen, obviously listening to everything. When Arthur was leaving, Sherry asked if she could speak with him alone for a moment. Cody went to the hallway without being asked. He was an extraordinarily perceptive child. Sherry looked at Arthur from the bed. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "I've been trying to figure out whether I should for a few weeks now." She reached for the drawer of the bedside table. "I have a letter. I wrote it in January, when I wasn't sure I was going to be able to have this conversation in person." Arthur sat back down. The letter was in a plain white envelope with no name on it. Sherry held it for a moment before she handed it to him, the way you hold something you've been carrying for a long time. "I think you should read it," she said, "and then I think we need to talk." He read it in the parking garage. He sat in his car in the gray fluorescent light of the third level of the Toronto General parking garage, and he read 6 handwritten pages, and by the time he reached the last one his hands were not quite steady. In the winter of 2001, Sherry Brandt had been 24 years old, and working at the administrative office of St. Michael's Hospital on a contract position. Arthur Penfield had been 39, newly separated and serving on the hospital's development board. They had met at a fundraising event in November. They had spent 6 weeks in each other's company, 6 weeks that Arthur had categorized in his own careful internal filing system as a difficult period, managed, resolved, and had not thought about since in any sustained way. Sherry had not told him. She hadn't told him because by the time she knew, the 6 weeks were over, and she had read him accurately enough to understand that he was a man in the middle of becoming someone, and she hadn't wanted to be the weight that pulled him sideways. She had a sister in Vancouver then, a support system, a plan. She had raised Cody alone, and she had done it well, and for 11 years she had believed she'd made the right choice. The letter did not ask Arthur for anything. That was the thing that undid him most, sitting in that parking garage with the pages in his hands. It wasn't a demand or an accusation. It was an explanation, patient and honest, written by a woman who thought she might be dying and wanted her son to have the truth available to him. "If you don't want this," she wrote near the end, "then I understand that too. But Cody deserves to know where he came from, and you deserve to know he existed. I'm sorry it took me this long to believe both those things at once." Arthur sat in the parking garage for 45 minutes, then he went back upstairs. Sherry was still awake. Cody had fallen asleep in the chair by the window, his head tilted sideways, his face completely unguarded in sleep in the way children's faces are when the vigilance finally lets go. Younger looking, softer, just a kid. Arthur stood in the doorway and looked at him. He looked at the particular angle of Cody's jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. He thought about the 11-year-old boy who had walked into Hearthstone on a February night and asked a stranger if he could sit at his table. He thought about the folded hands, the cracked sneaker, the gray-green eyes. He thought about the fact that Cody had asked, "Would you come with me? Not can I go with you, but will you come?" Wanting not to be led somewhere, but to have someone choose to be beside him. "I'd like to get a DNA test," Arthur said quietly, so as not to wake the boy. "Not because I doubt you, because I want Cody to have something that isn't just our word for it, something that belongs to him." Sherry nodded slowly. "I think that's right," she said, and after that Arthur said, "I'd like to talk about what comes next, if you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment, steady, assessing, the same look Cody gave people when he was deciding whether to trust them. "I'm willing," she said. It was 6 weeks later that a woman named Carol Maitland appeared. She arrived at Lakeshore Compass on a Tuesday morning in March, well-dressed, with a lawyer's business card and a story about being Sherry's oldest friend, practically family. Someone who had always meant to be more involved in Cody's life, and had simply been, she said with a practiced expression of regret, pulled in other directions. Bernadette listened to all of it with the patience of someone who had heard many versions of this particular story. Carol Maitland said that she felt Cody should be with people who knew his mother, knew his history, knew the world he came from. She said it with great warmth and concern. What she did not explain, not in that first meeting, was that Sherry owned a small property in Parkdale, bought years ago with an inheritance from her own mother, and that the question of what happened to that property, if Sherry did not recover, was a question with a financial answer that Carol had apparently been doing arithmetic around. Arthur's lawyer discovered this within 48 hours. It was Bernadette who told Cody carefully that there was a woman claiming to care about his future. Cody listened with his hands folded on the table, that gesture again, that formal stillness, and then he said, "My mom never talked about anyone named Carol." "No?" said Bernadette. "My mom talked about everyone," Cody said simply. "She talked about everyone she'd ever been close to. She didn't mention her." He was 11 years old and he had already learned to notice who his mother talked about and who she didn't. Arthur heard this secondhand and felt something in him go very quiet. He met with his lawyer that afternoon. Then he went to the hospital and he sat with Sherry, and he told her what was happening plainly, without managing it. Sherry's eyes went hard in a way he hadn't seen before. "She was at my apartment in January," she said. "She wanted to know if I had a will." Arthur said nothing. He didn't need to. "She knows about you now?" Sherry asked. "My lawyer reached out to hers this morning." Sherry leaned her head back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling. "She'll try to make this ugly. She's welcome to try," Arthur said quietly. The DNA results came on a Thursday. Bernadette called Arthur at 7 in the morning, which was earlier than they normally spoke, and he knew from the first syllable what she was going to say. He drove to the hospital. He walked past the nurse's station, past the window at the end of the hall, where the morning light came in at a low angle and turned the floor golden. He knocked on Sherry's door. She was awake. She had the results on her phone already, from the email notification that had arrived at 6:50. She looked at Arthur when he came in, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Cody was not there yet. He was coming at 9 with Helen Abernathy. Arthur sat in the chair by the bed. He and Sherry looked at the results together. 99.8%, the language of certainty, and Sherry put her hand over her mouth and took a breath that was not quite steady, and Arthur found he could not speak for a moment either. When Cody arrived, Arthur was still sitting in the same chair. Helen Abernathy brought him to the doorway and then stepped back, with the tact of someone who understood what kind of moment this was. Cody stood in the doorway in a new jacket. Helen had taken him shopping, quietly, with characteristic practicality, and he looked at his mother, and then at Arthur, and then at his mother again. Sherry held out her hand. Cody came to the bed and took it, and she held on to him and looked at Arthur, and in a voice that was calm and deliberate, because she had clearly decided in advance that she would do this calmly and deliberately, for her son's sake, she said, "There's something I want to tell you, sweetheart, something important about where you come from." Cody listened. He sat on the edge of his mother's bed, and he held her hand and he listened to everything. He did not interrupt. He was the most extraordinary listener Arthur had ever encountered, had been, he realized, from the very first night when he'd sat at that table and let Arthur ask his careful questions and actually heard what Arthur was really asking underneath them. When Sherry finished, the room was quiet. Cody looked at Arthur for a long time. Then he said, "You came back every Thursday." "Oh, yes," Arthur said. "Oh, you didn't know then. You came back anyway." It wasn't a question. Cody was making sure he had the sequence right, the way a person does when they're building something they intend to trust. "I came back anyway," Arthur said. Cody nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd been working out for weeks. Then he looked down at the bed, at his mother's hand over his, and he said something so quiet Arthur almost missed it. "Okay," Cody said, "just that. Okay." But the way he said it made it the largest word in the room. Carol Maitland's lawyer sent 2 more letters. The second one made implications that Arthur's legal team handled without drama and without the ugliness Carol had apparently been counting on. Property law, it turned out, is fairly unambiguous when the person making claims cannot demonstrate any meaningful relationship with the people in question. And Sherry, now strong enough to be transferred to a step-down unit, gave a very clear account of what Carol had and hadn't been in her life. Cody's account, when asked gently by Bernadette, was 3 words. "I don't know her." There was no third letter. Sherry came home to a rented apartment in the annex on the 1st of June, which was a Saturday, which meant Cody was not in school and could be there for the whole of it. Arthur had arranged for a private nurse 3 days a week, and Bernadette had connected Sherry with a physiotherapy program, and there was a casserole from Helen Abernathy in the fridge, because Helen was constitutionally incapable of letting a transition happen without food. Arthur stayed for the afternoon. He and Sherry sat at the kitchen table while Cody moved through the apartment, opening closets, investigating the bathroom, standing at the window and looking at the street below with an expression of cautious approval. "He's been doing that at the Abernathys too," Helen had told Arthur, "taking inventory, making sure the place is real." He came back to the kitchen and sat down across from Arthur. Biscuit the retriever was not there, but Cody appeared to have made peace with this. "There's a park at the end of the block," he said. "I saw that," Arthur said. "Do you play chess?" Arthur blinked. "I do, actually." Cody considered this. "There are chess tables in the park. I saw them on the way in." Arthur looked at him, at this boy who had walked into a restaurant in February with cracked sneakers and careful hands and had somehow, without either of them intending it, rearranged something fundamental in Arthur Penfield's life. "Sunday," Arthur said. Cody looked at his mother. Sherry was watching them both with an expression Arthur was still learning to read, something between relief and wonder and the particular complicated love of a mother who has protected her child alone for a very long time and is learning slowly that she doesn't have to anymore. "Sunday works," she said. Cody nodded. He put his hands flat on the kitchen table. Not folded this time, just open. easy, at rest. "Okay," he said, and this time it sounded like the beginning of something.